So our group project is on the American Civil War, which is also known as the bloodiest battle in the U.S. history. And so here's our table of contents, and each person is going to talk a little bit about the different topics that we picked to focus on during the Civil War.
The American Civil War had over 10,000 battles, which were fought across 23 states. There were over 650,000 casualties. The first battle occurred on April 12, 1861, in Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The last battle was on May 12, 1865, in Palmito Ranch, Texas. 1 in 5 Civil War soldiers died during the war. 2.1 million Northerners mobilized for the Union Army, while 880,000 Southerners mobilized for the Confederate Army. The First Battle of Bull Run, known in the South as the First Battle of Manassas, began on July 16, 1861. 35,000 Union troops, led by General Irvin McDowell, met 22,000 Confederate troops, led by General P.T. Beauregard, who was reinforced by 10,000 soldiers under the command of General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. This was the first major battle of the war. The Northerners believed it would be the only battle. Political leaders and citizens traveled to watch what they expected to be a quick and entertaining Union victory. The Confederate victory altered people's perception of how the entire war would go on. Union soldiers and their political caravan retreated to Washington on July 22nd. The Battle of Gettysburg, which was one of the most massive battles in American history, began on July 1, 1863, and lasted 3 days. There were 23,000 Union casualties and 28,000 Confederate casualties. Robert E. Lee and Richard Ewell led the Confederate, while Daniel Sickles and George Gordon Meade commanded the Union. Robert E. Lee turned in his resignation after the Confederate defeat, but it was denied by President Jefferson Davis. This battle turned the tide of the war in favor of the Union. The Confederacy expected a Union counterattack, but it never came. The 7 Days Battle occurred from June 25th through July 1st of 1862. It consisted of 6 different battles along the Virginia Peninsula. Union forces struck first with the goal of taking over the Confederate city of Richmond. 103,000 Union soldiers, led by General George B. McClellan, was met by 92,000 Confederate soldiers, led by General Robert E. Lee. The Confederate prevailed despite beginning with fewer soldiers and having more casualties. Lee saved Richmond and became the savior of the South.
I'm Cole Ferguson. This is Nationalism Propaganda during the Civil War. Nationalist propaganda both produced by both sides during the Civil War, particularly through the abolitionist movement and the entirety of the South. There was no official government-produced propaganda. Was not the most common kind. Primarily, propaganda spread through local newspapers and almanacs, namely through political cartoons and comics, as a lot of Civil War comics were cited as being the start of popularity of comics in the United States. Each side had a different way of going about the propaganda, as namely the Union had focused on appealing to highlighting the evils of slavery, and namely having graphic depictions of torture and other gruesome scenes, whereas Confederacy appealed to fear of integration with the slaves and effects of what happens if they lose. They were playing on a lot of racist fears and justifications for their fight. One thing to note is that many of the Union comics show that many Northerners were acutely aware of the situation a lot of slaves were in and the brutality they endured. Many Union propaganda makers had made an intention of distributing their propaganda to slave populations as well as free white Americans, whereas the Confederacy had namely distributed almost exclusively to white, normally slave-owning men. Here's an example of propaganda from the Union called The Persuasive Elegance of the Sunny South, that depicts a slave tied to a pole and being whipped, and the intent of it is to highlight the difference between typical ideas of Southern hospitality and eloquence compared to the gruesome acts that they commit during the slave times. Here's an example of Confederacy propaganda called the Amalgamation Waltz. This again plays on fears of what happens should the North win, as there would be feared that there would be complete integration. As you can see in the image, it shows exclusively black men dancing with white women, as that was a common trope that was played upon during this time. Nationalism was commonly spread almost exclusively through text, articles, essays, as well as word of mouth and local organizations. There were some illustrations and comics that existed. Those were primarily for more propaganda rather than nationalism. The Civil War had reinvigorated nationalism, as the only real time before this that had taken hold was during the Revolutionary War, and even then to a potentially less degree. Nationalism had taken hold much stronger in the South, in the Confederacy, than the Union. It was around during the Civil War, although it had reached many of its peaks in the years following. The nationalism in the South had originated the phrase the lost cause of the Confederacy, as that was the name they had taken during the time. And this idea or ideology was also the source of the phrase of Northern aggression. The core beliefs were that the South side in the Civil War was a just cause, and they often go about this by arguing that they were in line with Christian beliefs and ignored the tortures of slavery. It is also the source of many early KKK organizations, and has since seen a number of resurgences.
Okay, so I would like to tell you about some of the technological developments during the Civil War. So many of these technologies that were introduced during the war time period, they affected the way that not only the war was fought, they made it more efficient, but also the way that people lived their everyday lives. So while there were many various technological developments during this time period, I will be focusing on 4 of the main ones. And so I'll be talking about the way that weapons advanced, and I will specifically be telling you about the area of bullets and guns that were advanced, and I will be talking about submarines, the telegraph, and then lastly the railroad system. So prior to the war, soldiers fought with muskets, and so under this section of weapons, I'll be telling you more about how they developed and how it really revolutionized the way that the war was fought. And so, like I said, they fought with muskets, and these small guns could only hold a single bullet at a time. So as you can imagine, it was not very effective for fighting a war or intimidating their opponents. And this time required for a very extreme case of self-defense, and it just wasn't cutting it. And so Muskets also didn't allow for a very accurate shot, and so the war had to be fought at a closer range. So in 1848, Claude Monet invented a lead bullet, and it took the shape of a cone, and it was much smaller than the barrel of the gun. So it was easy to load, and it could be loaded very quickly during battle. And the smaller bullets also allowed for a more precise and accurate shot and allowed the bullet to travel through the air much faster. And so following this, repeaters were introduced to the scene, and this allowed for multiple bullets to be shot from a gun without having to reload it multiple times. And so, as you can imagine, this made defense much faster and much more accurate because not a lot of time was spent fumbling around to reload every single shot. And so, the next development that I'll be talking about on this slide was the submarines. And so these were large tanks that took the shape of a balloon, and they were made of steel, and they were filled with helium. And so these tanks were sent underwater, and this allowed individuals to gain information on where ships were. And a later invention, the telegraph system, was used to communicate to those on land about what they were finding. And so the submarines were also used to blockade ships and then sabotage enemy ports in the process. The last two developments that I would like to tell you about are the telegraph and then the railroad system. So beginning with the telegraph, Abraham Lincoln was actually the first president who was able to communicate by way of telegraph. And so this was thanks to the White House Telegraph Office, and this allowed him to send orders and reports to his men on the battlefield without having to physically be there. And this was huge during that time. It was like nothing they had ever seen or heard of. And then they wanted to bring this out to the rest of the people fighting in war. So in 1861, the Union Army, they established the U.S. Military Telegraph Corps, which allowed more than 1 million messages to be sent to and from the battlefield during this time, which was a huge advancement. And so of all of the technological developments that I'll be talking about, this has to be my favorite by far. I'm a big lover of my phone, social media, texting, calling my friends, and I just can really appreciate the way that this forever changed the way we're allowed to communicate with people near and far. So finally, the largest development of them all was the railroad system. And in this case, the Union had a very large advantage. They had more than 22,000 miles of track in the North, and the South was at a great disadvantage because there was only about 9,000 miles of track. And so you can see that huge difference in the size of this transportation system that they had. And so also in the southern regions, the tracks were not standardized. In between traveling carts and individuals had to be moved multiple times, and they had to be switched out. But overall, the railroad system really did revolutionize the way that we transport goods and people and services even today.
For my slides, I'm talking about what life was like for children in the Civil War. So because many men were away for war, tremendous hardships faced the children and the women who were left at home. So many children were called upon to fill the void of their absent fathers, and many worked in ammunition factories and in government offices. These are just some examples, though. The children took over many different jobs that their fathers may have been working on before they went off to fight in the war. And then some children even collected lint to make bandages, or they helped to collect food and supplies for soldiers. And so on the bottom left of my slide, I have a picture of children watching soldiers fight at Sudley Ford, Virginia, in what would become the Battle of Bull Run. This is interesting to me because I was I realized when I was researching that a lot of children kind of thought of the war as a joke or as like a game. They didn't really take it seriously at first, and then so many of them would go out and they would watch the soldiers fight as kind of like watching a sport, and then I don't think that they realized how violent it would be, how violent war is. In many different stories that I read that children would often come back different and a little bit dazed, different than they had been before they left. So, life for enslaved children during the Civil War. So, life for enslaved children brought an even heavier workload, and in some cases, children were forced into the fields at an even younger age, and often the children had to accompany their masters into war. And many of the teenage slave girls would tend to wounded soldiers, or they would nurse the wounded rebels. And there was also a lack of food, clothing, and homelessness and disease among children and families in the South during the war. And that's on both sides, not just enslaved families, but white families as well. There was just a lot of disease and lack of supplies during the war in the South. And many black children and black families fled to the Union for protection, out of fear of being persecuted or hurt for being possible Union sympathizers or just for being slaves in general. So, what the end of the Civil War brought for enslaved children? So, the Civil War officially ended in 1865 when General Johnston surrendered to General Sherman at Bennett Place. And the ending of the Civil War brought out different emotions in everyone, but the greatest impact was on enslaved children. So, enslaved children were at first very excited about the news of the war, but the excitement quickly turned to fear when they realized that racism would continue and it would develop into segregation in the white hate groups that would continue on for the next 100 years and into the 1960s and then into the civil rights movement. Many enslaved children ran to try and seek shelter at contraband camps, which were areas of refuge where refugees could work for earning, get educated, and worship. And a lot of these contraband camps were actually in North Carolina. They have a few pretty well-known and notable contraband camps. And how the Civil War impacted children throughout their lives. So the Civil War molded children's lives and affected them even into their adulthood. The war shaped their thoughts, opinions, and prejudices that would pass from generation to generation and would influence the way that things would develop. And like I said, into the 1960s, into the Civil Rights Movement, a lot of that thinking stemmed from what they had heard from family members, what had been passed down, and originating with these children from the Civil War time. The children of the Civil War first shared enthusiasm for the war, and like I said, they kind of thought of it as a game, but they were burdened with the greater responsibilities than what they had thought, and they endured physical and emotional hardships that they would carry with them into their adulthood. So for Northern children, the end of the war was a victory and excitement. But for Southern children, the end of the war was defeat and disappointment and brought a new way of living they weren't used to. They would have to adapt to the way that their world was now. And for enslaved children, the end of the war meant freedom, but which wouldn't come without years of suffering and hardships. And like I said, it would be a very long road, almost 100 years until they actually had the civil rights and the liberties that they deserved.
Of what we know now about disease in the 21st century, very little was known during the Civil War. Germ theory and Koch's postulates, which are both fundamental to health and medicine now, would not be proposed until the 1860s and the 1890s, respectively. Doctors and nurses did not practice sterilizing techniques and didn't even wash their hands between patients. Medicine was not particularly effective or even available. The conditions of the military camps were perfect for the transmission of pathogens with overcrowding and poor sanitation. New recruits from rural areas were especially susceptible to the diseases that spread through the camps due to their lack of exposure to illnesses that most soldiers would have experienced in childhood, which gave them lifelong immunity. The most common illnesses that afflicted soldiers were various gastrointestinal disorders, which caused acute or chronic diarrhea and dysentery. Soldiers in the South were commonly infected with malaria and yellow fever, which share a common vector, the mosquito. Typhoid fever, caused by Salmonella typhi, also plagued the soldiers. Typhoid fever was caused by the consumption of water and/or food that was fecally contaminated. The crowded and unsanitary camps made the perfect breeding ground for Salmonella typhi and flies, which could also transmit the disease to humans. Smallpox was also a concern for the soldiers. In an effort to prevent an epidemic, doctors attempted to use material taken from pustules of vaccinated soldiers as a vaccine in the absence of the actual vaccine for smallpox, which was not always available. However, this practice led to many soldiers who received this makeshift vaccine contracting syphilis. The Battle of Bull Run was the first major battle of the Civil War that revealed how woefully unprepared the medical community was for this war. Lacking a military ambulance corps, civilians volunteered to drive the ambulances. However, they fled upon the firing of the first shots. The fleeing civilians left the ambulances behind, which were promptly stolen by healthy soldiers also fleeing the battle. Not one injured soldier was returned to Washington, D.C. in an ambulance. Contrary to the popular belief that medicine during the Civil War was not state-of-the-art at the time, many advancements in both medical and surgical practices were made during the war. Some of the most notable advancements were the first plastic surgery, safe anesthesia usage, the development of an ambulance system, the establishment of large general hospitals, and the use of quarantine to isolate infected individuals. All of these practices, which have become so widely accepted to us today, were innovations during the Civil War. The effects of the war were far-reaching. A tenth of the Union soldiers were left either dead or incapacitated, versus a fourth of the Confederate soldiers. These deaths were caused by disease twice as often as combat wounds. African American soldiers were the worst off, with a death rate almost double that of the white men. Physical exams for the new recruits were forced to improve the quality and turn away more men who were far from able-bodied. The sheer number of sick and wounded led to the creation of many large hospitals. Because approximately 25% of surgeries performed during the war were amputations, Mississippi had to spend 20% of its budget for the entire year just on artificial limbs for veterans the year after the war. The Civil War was full of pain, death, and suffering for thousands of Americans. However, it also led to the establishment of innovative and helpful practices that would benefit Americans for generations to come.
So, my topic that I chose to focus on was the women's role during the Civil War. And so, what the idea that kind of like made me think about it was talking a lot about women's roles, a lot during like throughout the process of going through the semester and talking about women in different situations, no matter what the historical event it was. It's always just been a topic just because women have come such a far way in comparison to men. And so this first slide just kind of is like a brief overview. So basically when I did some research on like women's roles during the Civil War, I found out that there was like a variety of aspects. And just a few of those that I named would be working in farms. So a lot of women were married to men that owned property. And so when they went off, like especially plantations, like if they went off to war, the wife had to kind of take over roles that the men had, which was not normal in that time period. So a lot of women were working their farms, they were cooking and cleaning, which isn't really like a new thing that women were doing. It was just they had way more tasks on top of the tasks that they were already doing. So they were already cooking and cleaning and like being moms, taking care of their children, but now they were taking on all these other roles of being like a double parent, doing the jobs of their husbands to make sure that they are like having an income and have food to eat. And so a lot of them were put in charge of management. So say that they own farmland, they were now in charge of managing that land, making sure that people that worked for them were doing the jobs that they were supposed to be doing because their husband wasn't there to make sure that those jobs were being done. And so a lot of these roles were typically for men, but since the men were gone, it was not an option and the women had to step up. But also during this time period, there were a lot of female activists. And so women fighting for rights had already started to occur, but was put on pause because of the Civil War. And so there was already this tension building there. And so I kind of focused in on like abolitionists and the female activists, and just how that they were helping and contributing in society and not just necessarily their household. So, for example, women were raising money to send to soldiers. They were really kind of pushing women's rights, even though they had taken a little bit of a pause because of the war. And even the Underground Railroad was kind of going in this direction, and you'll see why later in the slides. So, while doing some research, I came across Clara Barton because I focused on some key players during the Civil War that were women. So, Clara Barton, she founded the American Red Cross in 1881, and it was because she served as a nurse during the Civil War, but where she stood apart was that she would actually aid to soldiers in the field during the war. So she was collecting supplies from communities, and she was actually going into the battlefields herself to deliver these supplies and aid to the troops. And so when she, after the war, she went overseas to Switzerland and saw the Red Cross Foundation, and so she essentially brought it back to America and established the American Red Cross, which is still very known today. The next woman I focused on was Susan B. Anthony, who was a women's activist, and she is very well known for the different groups that she was in supporting women's rights, and got very famous after the Civil War was over. But during the war, she was still very urgent for women's advocacy and rights of women, and she also was a part of the American Anti-Slavery Society. And so she was very against slavery, I guess, being in the North, and did as much as she could as a white woman to help that cause. And the last woman that I researched was Harriet Tubman. And after the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st in 1863, African Americans were allowed to enlist in the Civil War. And so this was a good time for the Underground Railroad, which I mentioned earlier. And Tubman was a very key component to that operation. She helped save many slaves from their slave owners. And I thought this was interesting, but one of Tubman's biggest accomplishments was the Combahee River Raid. And that was where 150 black soldiers that were part of the South Carolina Battalion crossed the river at night and freed 750 slaves from slaveholders from the surprise attack. And she was the ringleader for that entire operation. And what was kind of shocking to me is it took Tubman over 30 years to get compensated for her efforts during the Civil War, which means that she did all of these great things and was such a key component in the Civil War. But since she was a woman, it took her 30 years to be paid back for all of the efforts that she put in. So, just looking at these three women, you can already see that women were such a key part of the Civil War, even though they were not the ones fighting.